Oikein hyvää iltaa ja tervetuloa Israel Nyt-katsauksen pariin. Minä olen Pasi Turunen, Patmos-lähetyssäätiön toiminnanjohtaja, ja tämän katsauksen jälleen tarjoaa sinulle Patmos-lähetyssäätiö. Tämän iltaisessa Israel Nyt-katsauksen erikoisjaksossa vieraanani on kansainvälisesti tunnettu antisemitismin tutkija ja luennoitsija Izabella Tabarovsky, jonka tutkimus- ja kirjoitustyö on keskittynyt entisen Neuvostoliiton antisionismiin ja nykypäivän vasemmistolaiseen antisemitismiin. Tämän lisäksi neuvostojuutalaisuus, holokausti Neuvostoliitossa, Stalinin sortotoimet ja historiallisen muistin politiikka ovat Tabarovskyn tutkimuskohteena. Izabella Tabarovsky nousi otsikoihin Suomessa Helsingin Sanomien uutisoitua verkkolehdessä 7. päivä helmikuuta, kuinka 2 suomalaista yliopistoa, Åbo Akademi ja Helsingin yliopisto, peruivat yllättäen hänen kutsunsa tulla luennoimaan Suomeen tammikuun lopussa pidettävään antisemitismiä käsittelevään konferenssiin. Peruutuksen takana oli somekohu, jonka aiheutti nimettömänä toimiva aktivistiryhmä Instagramissa Tutkijat Palestiinan puolesta. Olin törmännyt Tabarovskyn tuotantoon, kirjoituksiin ja luentoihin netissä ja aikaisemminkin. Peruutuskohun johdosta otin häneen yhteyttä ja pyysin haastattelua, jonka hän ystävällisesti antoi. Miten Tabarovsky koki luentojensa peruuttamisen ja miksi nykyvasemmiston antisionistinen retoriikka muistuttaa niin läheisesti entisen Neuvostoliiton antisionistista retoriikkaa. Tässä ovat aiheitamme tänään. Tervetuloa mukaan. Here we are, and what was this all about? I am happy to have with me Izabella Tabarovsky. Welcome to Israel Now podcast, Izabella.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I had read some of your articles and seen your lectures in the web. And when I saw your picture in the newspaper, I said, hey, that's Izabella Tabarovsky. And then I started reading. I said, what's happening? She was coming to Finland, but now she's not coming to Finland. And it was a great disappointment. You wrote recently about this thing which had just happened but at the end of January. Please walk us through what happened.
Well, this conference that I was coming to at Åbo Akademi on antisemitism had been planned for months and months and months. Finland had been on my calendar probably for at least 9 months or so. I remember actually talking to people at Åbo Akademi, and they were already asking me about the title of the lecture and some details. And I thought, wow, people in Finland plan things way in advance. That's great. And then, so everything was already set for me to go to Finland. And then 2 days, or a week before the event, and just a few days before I was scheduled to fly, the organizers started to write to me and say that there was a campaign that apparently started against me on Instagram, and sent me some screenshots, and I looked at them, and of course I'm a student of anti-Zionist and anti-Israel propaganda. That's what I study, and I immediately understood what was going on. It was accusations of it's what people who are Zionists, you could say, who essentially support Israel's right to exist, are often accused of. And what I didn't expect, though, is how quickly the universities would collapse. I'll say honestly, I didn't know anything about the academic culture in Finland at the time. I didn't know how many protests there were, what was going on. In the US, of course, it's a very intense period, so I understood. But in Finland, I didn't know. Well, it took only a couple of days for the Åbo Akademi University and University of Helsinki, where I was scheduled to give a public lecture, to cave. And from then, everything unfolded. I just started following the press. My contacts in Finland were showing me what was being published. I myself started writing because I thought that the universities owed me an explanation, because in principle I understood. But I thought, okay, well, I want to know, what will they say? How do they explain what really happened? How did they view what happened? And so I started corresponding with 2 people from the 2 universities. And, as I wrote in the article that I just published, the correspondence really, I found it kind of astonishing, because you could really see that there wasn't a clear, the excuse that they used to cancel the lectures, that they were ashamed of it, that they couldn't admit to it. And so they were kind of going round and round and contradicting themselves. And so that's from there it became very clear to me what had happened, and so I described that in my piece.
Right. I also read your latest piece about this whole thing that happened, and I must underline the fact that you are a scholar of this Soviet form, the anti-Zionist propaganda of Soviet Union. So this must have come to you as some kind of a, I don't know, shock or surprise that it comes from. But did it actually? When you know the background of Finland a little bit about our Finlandization, so this was like what someone has called the tale of Finlandization. Although we are now very closely attached to West, there is still this kind of thinking in academia.
Well, it's interesting because so the title of my lecture was, I don't know if I can reproduce it exactly now, the USSR, the Cold War, the Third World, from the USSR to university campuses today, semicolon, something
I have
about
it here if you want. Yeah,
oh,
I can say it's from the Cold War to university campuses today, the USSR, the Third World, and contemporary anti-Zionist discourse.
Right,
Very
exactly.
interesting.
So, well, that's right. I mean, that's what I think. And I know that this lecture it's a lecture that I've given many times, or this version of the lecture. And, I vary depending on the context a little bit, but it's a story that most people don't know. And so I go over the history of Soviet anti-Zionism, primarily focusing on the kind that began in 1967, the campaign that began in 1967. I mean, the USSR was always anti-Zionist for various reasons, which we can't go into now. But in 67, a really massive, rabid campaign began. It was international, it was global, it targeted the global left, it targeted the Third World. The USSR really saw danger in Zionism, that they viewed Zionism as an ideology that could threaten and undermine its international position. They saw that there were so many Jews in the U.S., they were Zionists. So there was, they really viewed it in very conspiracist terms, which is how it intersects with classic anti-Semitism. Because in classic anti-Semitism, Jews are viewed as global, kind of global danger, right, that threatens to overwhelm all of the societies. So the Soviets essentially used the same tropes that are used in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. They just replaced the word Jew with the word Zionist. And so it became this view of a global Zionist conspiracy that's anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-left, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the story that I wanted to tell. This is the story that most people don't know. A lot of people know what happened under Stalin, but this is the story people don't know. And what's interesting about this story is that it actually shows the pathways through which this propaganda traveled to the West. And it helps understand ways in which, I mean, it's not the only way, but it's a crucial way in which this propaganda affected the way the left, the anti-Israel left, thinks about Israel and Zionism. And it already, by the early 70s already, the fringes of the left were speaking in this language. They were viewing Israel as a genocidal, terrorist state, settler colonial, imperialist, racist, fascist, equated it with Nazis. It was already part of the far left thinking. So it's not just contemporary. And so this is the story that I tell. And when my lecture got canceled, I looked at the title. So one of the professors I was interacting with was telling me, well, this is a bad title, sort of, it's a controversial title. And I'm looking at the title and I'm asking him, well, what's controversial? The Soviet part that I'm talking about, the USSR, or the anti-Zionist part? And from talking to some of my, recent friends, I formed some friendships in Finland over this time also. I understood that actually the way that Finland experienced the Cold War and the closeness it was essentially forced into, we can say, okay, it was forced to in order to maintain its independence with the USSR, that perhaps it hasn't really been fully processed. And that's why in this article, I talk both about that context, that perhaps there is something in Finland, and I don't know it. I just essentially raise questions, that perhaps there's something in Finland or there are parts of Finland that are still, uncomfortable with that story and with Finland's role during the Cold War. We know that Finnish intellectuals participated in the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign. I give some examples of that. And so it was that, in addition to the more current issues of, that we are seeing against the background of Israel's war in Gaza.
Right. Izabella, let me take two quotes from another article that you wrote, and we can, and then I ask you a little bit to explain this, how this propaganda, anti-Zionistic propaganda from Soviet Union has found its way to the modern discourse. And I found these two quotes very, very interesting, because I've been always wondering that why is it? Is there some reason why this anti-Zionist tropes, genocide, apartheid, all these kind of things, why it always comes from the left? And it seems that you have at least explained one pathway, how it comes. And in one of your articles you said like this, that this half-century-old Soviet propaganda is how precisely, what's so interesting about this half-century-old Soviet propaganda is how precisely it mirrors the language emanating from the anti-Israel left since October 7. So it is, first of all, very current. And then you say another place that this anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist discourse of today's college students feels like deja vu to those of us who grew up in the USSR. I forgot to mention that you are native born in the former Soviet Union. So help us to understand this how this propagandistic discourse happens nowadays. It didn't start in October 7. It didn't start in Durban 2001. It started way, way back.
Yes, correct. Well, so in one of my articles, I trace some of these channels. The USSR was really active in the post-colonial world. It really took advantage of the decolonization that was happening in what was then called the Third World. Today we call it the Global South. And, it organizes masses of conferences, youth festivals, symposia, all kinds of leftist gatherings, which were filled with the kind of rhetoric that we know the left continues to deploy today, anti-American, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, etc. And in that rhetoric, they started to insert, after 67, they started to insert the anti-Zionist language. And what's interesting is that we still have people today, including in Finland, I don't want to name names, but we have people who are, in America, for example, we have Angela Davis. In the UK, we have people who are close to Jeremy Corbyn, who continue, they were part of that milieu, they were part of that environment. George Galloway, for those of your listeners who know, in the UK, they all can trace their background to that milieu, that international kind of global ecosystem in which people were all surrounded with this language, which was both, a lot of them came from the anti-apartheid movement, and it all easily and naturally flowed for them from protesting against apartheid to then equating Israel. Once this parallel was given to them, then they became pro-PLO and they became anti-Israel, and they simply never changed. And what's fascinating for me about this group of people who, again, they all went on from their activism. They all came to occupy places in the academia. They all become journalists, writers, intellectuals. Once the USSR falls apart in 1989, for them, or rather in 1991, for them, it's as if it never happened, and you see how for a lot of them, there is a break in their careers right around that time. Why? Because Soviet financing stops flowing, because the USSR now has it's fallen apart. And so they change their careers. That's approximately when Angela Davis quits the Communist Party because the money is no longer there, And they all go on into universities and they bring these ideas with them. So we have this going on now for 2 or 3 generations. And it's at this point, I think, that in certain circles on the left, people are not even questioning these ideas. It's a given for them. It's like this is what's true. The second part that you're asking about, the Soviet Jewish experience, one of the reasons I think it's so important, it's also something that a lot of people don't understand, but you do, because you just told me that you were active in the Refusnik movement, in the Soviet Jewry movement, is that if you grew up in the USSR like I did, you have heard all of this language before. Okay, so there are some, to be sure, okay, there are some things that are new that have come up after. So the slogan "from the river to the sea," it doesn't come from the USSR. So it wouldn't have been in that literature and in that environment for us. But all this whole equation of Zionism, redefinition of Zionism, from a movement for the liberation of the Jewish people and for the sovereignty of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, they redefined Zionism to represent all of the evils from the point of view of the left, right? What are the greatest evils from the point of view of the left and many other people, right? Most other people. So obviously racism, Nazism, fascism. These are evils, universal evils. And then there are other things, imperialism and colonialism, settler colonialism, etc., apartheid. So Zionism got equated to all of it because it was really important for the Soviets to demonize it. This is what we mean by the word demonization. This is kind of how Jews have been demonized through the centuries, but in religious terms. So in the religious terms, they would be equated with the devil. Well, the left doesn't believe in religion, right? So what is the closest approximation of the devil for the left? It's the Nazis. So the Soviets redefine it. And we Soviet Jews have the experience of living in an environment where this language is dominant. And we know exactly what happens when it becomes dominant. The division or the difference between Zionist and Jew, which the left insists on, becomes erased. And then every Jew is viewed as, representing that Zionist evil. And that's where Soviet Jews were excluded from entire professions and careers and universities and field of study. And we know and remember it. And so when I began to first notice it several years ago in America, I began to write about it and I started warning American Jews, but I think it was really too hard for most to understand the meaning of what I was saying. And now people see it. And I talk about this history, and I would have talked about this history in Finland also, because I think it addresses one of the key issues that the left really likes to kind of blur. The left likes to say, well, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same. Anti-Zionism is criticism of Israel. Anti-Semitism is demonization of Jews. They're really not the same. You can't equate them. This is kind of the ultimate transgression to equate them. And I come to them, and there are a lot of philosophical discussions about it. There are legal discussions about it. And I come to them and I say, we have decades of experience of millions of Jews in the USSR, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and by the way, in the Arab countries too, which proves that any time a society adopts this kind of anti-Zionist discourse, anti-Semitic outcomes follow.
Yeah, and when I read about this cancellation that happened with your invitation, I noticed how pervasive this language is, because you were claimed to be a legitimizer of settler colonial apartheid states. So these slurs, were immediately attached to this invitation. In your articles, you described how this anti-Zionist campaign in the former Soviet Union was run by government. So it was not some kind of a haphazard, some lunatic writing here and there, but it was actually a government program. And that was something which was quite shocking to realize, that it was so pervasive. Can you describe a little bit? They had even some kind of anti-Zionist People's Committee, or what it was, who published books and leaflets and all kinds of things.
Right, exactly. So once the Soviets defined Zionism as one of their key ideological enemies, and again, this happens in 1967. Why is it 1967? 1967 is when Soviet Arab allies are defeated by Israel. And that defeat, the Soviets view it in highly personal terms. It threatens, they think that it threatens their interests in the Middle East. They think that Israel couldn't have done it on its own. Clearly, there is some conspiracy operating against them. It's important to understand that the mentality of Soviet security services was always, and in general, the political culture in the USSR was always prone to this kind of paranoid thinking, conspiracist thinking, which is it characterizes totalitarian societies in general. So they see Zionists everywhere, in every corner, under every bed. But in order to communicate this idea to the world, right, they now have this idea that they need to shift public opinion. They see how much public opinion in the world stands on the side of Israel, so they want to work against it. They want to carve out a portion of global public opinion that will support them. And because this is a massive state and it has everything, all of the media and the academia, absolutely everything is in its hands and under its control, it begins to think, and it's, of course, by now, it doesn't think too much about it. It doesn't have to think too much about it because it knows exactly how to shape hearts and minds, right? How to influence hearts and minds, how to shape narratives. I mean, this was one of the key key successes of the USSR. They always knew how to shape or create a certain narrative and impose it on people and inculcate it. And so they understand that, okay, well, first of all, they need as many periodicals as possible to repeat the same ideas in as many languages as possible. And so in the late 60s, early 70s, they have news bureaus, quote unquote, essentially propaganda outlets operating practically in every country in the world. So they start to work with them. They're all working with local press. They all put out, there's some outlets that the Soviets sponsor. So they all start to propagate the same ideas in multiple languages. You know, if you look at what some of the publications that we know to have been sponsored by the Soviets began writing in 1967 about Israel and about Zionism, you can see it's the same source. You know, you don't just multiple groups, I don't know, from the UK to South Africa, don't suddenly invent the same language and the same terminology. It's clear that the money comes from Moscow and the language comes from Moscow as well. So this is happening. They also realize that in order to have legitimacy, they need to involve the academy. And so they designate several groups within the Soviet Academy that are kind of, they form the nucleus of kind of formulating the academic version of anti-Zionist propaganda, and they start formulating theories on what Zionism is and on how Israel functions. And these groups form relationships with academics outside the country. So it becomes this international kind of academic anti-Zionist universe. And the periodicals, and they also segment them into different categories. So there are military periodicals also published in multiple languages that write about Zionism in these terms. And then there are periodicals that are directed at, literary figures, et cetera, et cetera. So it really, and it gets instituted in universities and in schools, and they introduce this whole lectures. In the USSR, it was really popular to kind of communicate political ideas via lectures right at the workplace. So at factories, in collective farms. So that becomes part of the campaign. So it's really, really kind of very comprehensive. So this language becomes really embedded both in the USSR and among the global left in the Third World, where the Soviets had a lot of influence.
What should we learn for today about the situation? And is there anything we can do to kind of turn the tide when we see this kind of anti-Zionistic rhetoric coming, which seems to have a very, very powerful impact in the world today?
Yeah, and well, before I even answer this question, I feel like I need to say it's become almost obligatory to say that, of course, we're not talking about regular criticism of Israel. I think a lot of Jews are already tired of saying it because, of course, we ourselves are critical of Israel all the time. But there is a difference. We all have to learn the difference between simply criticizing specific policies, criticizing specific figures, criticizing certain approaches, versus the kind of criticism that turns into demonization and draws on those classic conspiracy theory tropes, right, that originate with the protocols of the elders of Zion. So anytime you sound like you view Zionism as some kind of a universal evil force, you have to know you are in that territory where you have walked right into demonization. So what are we to learn? I mean, I think that we need to understand the history of this rhetoric. We need to understand that, sometimes people think, well, this language of social justice, and I mean, this is really the brilliance of this language, is that it comes wrapped in the language of social justice, and people think, well, look, some kids on the campus at Berkeley have invented this language because they really care about Palestinians. Well, the truth is there is nothing organic about this language. It's not some kids who just came up with it. No, this was produced by propaganda and security organs of a totalitarian state, tested out globally on millions of people over decades. So I think just understanding this already would be important, I think. We need to understand that just like it's important to understand how Nazi propaganda played into what happened to Jews during World War II, we need to understand that the left produced its own anti-Jewish rhetoric, and we need to understand its impact, not only on the Jewish people, but also on the society in general, because what it brings with it is anti-Western sentiments, and it brings with it real serious illiberalism. I mean, it's a very illiberal ideology. And I think that another thing that we need to understand is that, first of all, it's not going to take us a few weeks or a few months or even a couple of years to defeat this. This is something that has been inculcated over generations. So I think that it's a generational task to change this mentality. And the thing that's perhaps good about it, and I don't want to speak for Finnish Academy, but I can certainly say it about the American Academy, is that the American Academy needs profound reform. It needs reform in the way it's dominated by far left thinking. We need diversity of opinion in the academy. And along with reshaping the academy so that it accommodates a variety of perspectives, a variety of opinions, and stops indoctrinating and rather teaches people to think critically, we would also then bring in speakers and lecturers and professors who also offer a different perspective on Israel, right? And a different perspective on the Israel-Gaza conflict. Because so much of, for example, the things that the campaigners against me accused me of, they said, well, she denies the genocide in Gaza. Well, even the UN has not said that there is a genocide in Gaza going on. It's a legal definition. So it's very much a matter of debate. But once you censor it, once you force everyone through pressure to say, well, there has been a genocide in Gaza, well, you have eliminated debate. So I think we all need to return to our principles as democratic, as societies that adhere to principles of liberal democracy. So we need to go back to basics, essentially, is what I'm saying.
What you just said, it brings to my mind that when often someone accuses that the label anti-Semitism is a conversation stopper, these Soviet propaganda slurs have functioned the same way. You support genocide. Why do you support? You are an apartheid state, or there's something like this. They tend to stop the debate, and that's it.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right.
Okay, Izabella, you mentioned that this is a generational battle. Do you see where do you see the silver lining, or do you see that it is going to be calm before the storm?
Well, you mean the silver lining in the storm that we're having now? You mean, is there a silver lining?
In general, about this rhetoric, how it's going.
Well, I mean, look, perhaps in a way it forces us to rethink why it forces us to rethink our commitments. Certainly I would say that in the Jewish community, it forces us to think again, why is Israel so important to us? Why is it important to the Western civilization? And I think, a lot of times there is this sort of a cliche, which I happen to think is true, is that Jews are a canary in the coal mine, that once a society begins to attack its Jews, it's kind of a symptom that there is a crisis, a deeper crisis in the society. It's a sign that, anti-Semitism is also often compared to a virus that surfaces when the society's immune system is down. So I think that the crisis we're having is an opportunity for us to ask, what is really going on? What is going on in our societies? And we see, certainly, again, I speak for the United States because that's what I know best. We've seen other kind of the inflow of other illiberal ideologies that have come along, and so it's a chance for us to address this problem in a bigger way. more global way.
Okay, finally, let's come back to this case in Finland. Are you expecting something to happen, or is there still going on some kind of trying to get things cleared up, what happened and things like that?
I personally am not really expecting anything. For me, it's already, I haven't gone, I've reflected on my experience, but I do what I think would be important for me. And first of all, I think, this was a really interesting case because it generated a kind of debate that I don't think my lectures would have generated. If I had those lectures, I would have delivered them, I don't know, maximum, let's say a couple hundred people would have heard them in the best case scenario. Once they got canceled, it's a very good, I think, lesson for people who are tempted to censor certain points of view, right? That once you censor, you always run the danger of the issue exploding. And so I can see that the questions raised by this cancellation, by this censorship, are being debated in Finland. And so it's multiple questions, right? It's not only Israel and Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. It's also, what values do universities stand for in democratic societies, right? What is censorship? Why are we censoring some views but not others? So I just hope that these, and then of course, the Cold War history and past. And so I just hope that this debate will continue and that it will help, both my friends in Finland, because again, so I've encountered what I encountered, but I also made really good friends. And I hope that that this brings better outcomes. That debate brings better outcomes.
Right. Well, thank you, Izabella. Thank you for your time. And I would love to discuss with you, hours and hours about your research. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I make sure that I put some links to the comment section for people to find your articles and your YouTube lectures that they can see and read for themselves. Thank you very much. Have a good day,
Pasi,
and let's hope there are better days ahead.
Thank you so much for having me.